What's good, gamers? Akalon here, and of course, welcome back to each and every one of you. I literally just woke up, and I've had this thing that I want to talk about because it's constantly all over my feed on Twitter or X and on the comment section of my last video. Everyone seems to be talking about this, and I thought, yeah, okay, let's just address this once and for all so we can get on with our lives and start looking forward to the future of World of Warcraft. Steve Danuser has been confirmed gone now, by the way. If you look on his LinkedIn page, it says former lead narrative designer of Blizzard Entertainment. And currently, it doesn't state that he has a new job. I think he's going to take some time before he tries his hand at gaming again. I don't think the gaming industry has been kind to Mr. Danuser. I mean, if you look at the insane amounts of abuse that Steve Danuser has taken, and you know what? Oftentimes, I was complicit in that. I called him names. I was very angry at some of the stories that he wrote. And for my part, I've apologized in the past. I will apologize gladly here again. I believe it's important to apologize when you acted wrong or when you acted like a complete dickhead. You know, I think you should apologize, especially when it moves you to apologize. What I will not apologize for is my criticisms of him. It's one thing to criticize, it's another thing to harass, right? And for the most part, I have only ever criticized, but there have been times where I could look at it and say, yeah, that was a little harassy, you know, just like ever so slightly, a slight tinge of harassment in that, especially, you know, when you refer to the guy as the C word or, you know, something slightly less savory. But, you know, never mind that. I apologize sincerely for that. In fact, the dude has experienced so much harassment and hate that he's left Twitter altogether. He announced that he's moving over to Blue. I think it's the Facebook one. And yeah, he can't be doing X anymore. Apparently, the hate that he's getting is just too much. Now, let's talk about Steve Danuser. I myself is on record as saying that Steve Danuser is a really bad writer. Since then, I've had some time to think, and it's not that Steve Danuser is a bad writer. It's more that Steve Danuser was a bad writer for WoW. And there's a reason for that. You see, when it comes to stories, there's a certain expectation, and expectations are important. It's what the audience is trained to expect from a given story. Now, what is it that has made World of Warcraft as special as it is? Why is it that all of us have played WoW and started playing WoW 10, 15 years ago? Even longer for some, like myself. Why is that the case? Well, the answer is, it's weird to say, but WoW has always been an incredibly dark story told very lightheartedly. And I genuinely think that that has been WoW's biggest strength, has been its ability to handle very problematic material. I mean, we're talking about shit like Alexstrasza being captured and forced to breed against her will, and the Dragonmaw clan using her offspring as war dragons, effectively. You know, these are storylines that exist in World of Warcraft. There's plenty of genocide and slavery stories in World of Warcraft history, and yet the way they're handled is almost always very lighthearted. Not insofar as they're making light of the situation, but it's very easy to palate that shit. Like, you don't feel overwhelmed by the darkness of the story. In many ways, it's in stark contrast to something like, for example, Warhammer 40k, where the universe is grim dark, and the feeling that they wish to invoke within you is that of grim darkness. You should feel the oppressiveness of the universe around you, and it's what makes that story work, and it's why the audience loves that story so much. In World of Warcraft, it was dark, not quite as dark as Warhammer 40k. It wasn't grim dark, but it was dark, and it was handled in a comedic way. There was a slight lightheartedness to that. Now, to be fair, it wasn't Steve Danuser that did away with the original concept, the expectation of the audience. In fact, I would argue that it was Alex Afrasiabi who first started to change the expectations that WoW had. It went from under Alex Afrasiabi, and really Alex Afrasiabi took over at the beginning of Legion, because that's when Chris Metzen was fully gone from the company, and now Alex was the creative director. Now, the story was still relatively good because fundamentally, WoW was still adhering to the expectation of the audience, which is very dark, heavy, war filled storylines. But what Alex had lost was that light-hearted touch to the stories. If you look at Legion, the story became like markedly darker throughout Legion, with a lot fewer moments of comedy, with a lot fewer light-hearted moments to sort of offset the incredibly dark moments within World of Warcraft. And Alex Afrishabi oversaw Legion, BFA, and a lot of Shadowlands, may I add. Of course, there were massive rewrites in Shadowlands, but a lot of Shadowlands was the baby of Alex Afrishabi. And you can see how every single expansion descended more and more into a much darker storytelling. Then Danuser takes over at the beginning of Shadowlands, but really at this point too late to make massive changes. But Danuser did make a lot of changes in Shadowlands. And then that leads us into Dragonflight. And you can very clearly see Danuser's hand in Dragonflight. Danuser didn't want to return to Metzen's dark but light-hearted. He didn't want to continue Alex Afrishabi's dark but fucking dark. Right? What Danuser wanted to do was a new type of story. A story that would bring people together. A story of love and friendship, rather than just consistently death and killing. And so it almost became this you could see the formulaic approach of Danuser's storytelling, where there'd be a little war and a little killing, and then we come together in friendship at the end. Right? And this was sort of the formula for all of the storylines that Danuser told. But under Danuser, there were some phenomenal stories as well. And this is why I say he wasn't a bad writer. He was a bad writer for WoW. If you look at the Blue Dragon questline, phenomenal. The Black Dragon questline, absolutely brilliant. The way it ended was a little weird, but still really, really good. Even the Bronze Dragon questline, again, really, really good, except for the end where Chromie runs and hugs his leg like she's some child. That was weird as shit. But for the rest of it, it was pretty cool, right? Most of the side stories, at least, were really well done. And this tells you that Steve Danuser isn't a bad writer. The problem was just that what Steve Danuser envisioned WoW to become isn't what the audience wanted WoW to be. And so this really allowed things to fall apart. Now, let's get into the future of World of Warcraft, since I've already been talking for about 7 minutes and 40 seconds. So the longest intro in the history of videos ever, by the way. But let's get into what the future for World of Warcraft holds. In the future, I saw a lot of people saying, we can't go back to the faction wars, please, no more of that. We get that you guys want to return to war, and yes, we do. I want war, but I'm here to tell you, faction war isn't the only war. The truth of the matter is, the faction war in World of Warcraft has been completely hollowed out. There is no faction war that you could sell the player base that they would buy. What you would need in order for any new faction war to actually work is a grand fucking betrayal. Like, something huge would need to happen. I'm talking burning down Orgrimmar or Stormwind levels, right? And there are ways of swinging it. So you could have it actually be a secret sort of underground movement within one of the factions. So, for example, imagine within the Alliance, there is this faction of anti-Horde members that hate the Horde so much that they believe that the Alliance cannot forgive the Horde for all of the atrocities that they had committed. Maybe there are some Night Elves at the forefront of this, joined by some of the Worgen. And under the guise of the Alliance, they infiltrate Orgrimmar, plant a bunch of bombs, and blow the whole thing up, and leaving Alliance banners and enough evidence there that this was the Alliance, and maybe even SI7 was involved in this whole thing. And you would have to ensure that some of the leaders die in this coup. Now, if that happened, the Horde would be forced to respond in absolute force, which means one of the Alliance cities probably gets fucking ransacked and destroyed by a mana bomb again, say, for example. And now you have the faction war back, right? The two factions are once again drawn into a conflict that you could resolve further down the line, but because ultimately you could eventually have it come out that this was all done completely wrongly. And in all honesty, it wasn't the Horde or the Alliance that really was involved in the start of this war. It was some other faction. The problem with that is you would have to resolve it eventually, because that's just the nature of World of Warcraft. You can't have the two factions fight each other when you also have outside threats fighting each other. Azeroth is simply too small for wars on all fronts to take place. So you're almost always forced, in a way, to take the story away from the faction battle and move it towards the next big bad threat, so as to make the big bad threat feel like an actual real threat. Now, the thing is, that's not the only war that players want. In fact, if you speak to the vast majority of people that want war back in World of Warcraft, we are talking about people that don't want the faction war back, but they do want war back. And when we say war, what we're talking about is we don't want this goody two-shoes, power of friendship, love thy brother storylines. We want the storylines where things get slaughtered and murdered all the time, and that makes things fun. And the way you could do that in World of Warcraft without invoking the faction war is to have far smaller regional battles. So, in other words, you could now have a story, and this is a story that is served to you on a fucking platter. You have the Worgen that just retook Gilneas. You have the Forsaken that has just retaken Undercity. What if there is a faction of Worgen who do not agree that the Forsaken is no longer a threat, who believes that the Forsaken needs to be eradicated if Gilneas is ever going to be safe? Their argument being, if the Forsaken could once before capture and destroy Gilneas, what is stopping them from doing it again? And so this faction's argument becomes reality, and they invade Forsaken lands, right? And they start slaughtering Forsaken, and maybe they start blowing up Brill, or whatever the case might be. This then prompts a response from the Forsaken, but not the Forsaken leadership, just a faction within the Forsaken who wish to respond, because the leadership of the Forsaken have already spoken to the leadership of the Worgen, and they know that the Worgen as a whole isn't responsible for this conflict, and the Worgen themselves are trying to stamp out this movement of renegades within their ranks. And so the Forsaken isn't willing to take the war to the Worgen, because the Worgen as a whole is innocent of this. And now you have these two little factions of the Worgen and of the Forsaken just fighting it out, right? And fighting over resources, fighting over certain parts of the map. You can even bring back things like war fronts in this regard, except now it's not a war front between the Horde and the Alliance. No, it's a war front between the Forsaken and the Worgen, and specifically two factions between the Forsaken and the Worgen. And what makes this even more interesting is players can choose which side of the faction they wish to back. If you have a player, for example, that want to back the Worgen, but he is off the Horde, he can do that if he believes that the Worgen have a rightful claim on Forsaken lands, and therefore, the Forsaken acted poorly or wrongly. Players could do that because these factions aren't part of the greater factions. They're little groups within the greater factions. And you would have to have these wars be large enough that players actually care about them, but not so large that the two factions get involved in those wars. If you have small little stories, like hundreds of them, littered all over the map, I think players would love that, because it brings back the war elements of World of Warcraft without having to reinvoke the faction war. That being said, though, my prediction is that we will see the return of the faction war at some point in WoW, and that it will almost inevitably be because of some misunderstanding or some covert operation that we will see the faction war return. And the reason I know this is, for a short while at the beginning of Dragonflight, there was almost this hyper focus on friendship, and we're no longer at war and we no longer hate each other. And slowly but surely, that's evolved. That's changed. Towards the end here, with the Forsaken retaking of Undercity, and also the retaking of Gilneas, you hear the Forsaken and Kalia Menethil specifically say that we are not friends. We help them because we had a debt to repay. But things will always be strained between the Worgen and the Forsaken. just sort of laying the seeds of doubt in this piece, that there is no actual peace between the Worgen and the Forsaken. As much as they may want it, it's probably not going to happen. That's a stark change from the beginning of Dragonflight to now. There's another instance where this happened, where one of the opposite faction leaders basically said the same thing. We're not friends. And that this peace is tenuous at best. But I can't remember which one it was now. But it struck me while I was playing, and I was like, oh, that's different. So I do think that we are getting the setup for another faction war that will at some point break out. I just hope Blizzard does it right this time. But hey, that's it from me. Thank you so much for watching. All of the patrons, thank you so much for your support. If you want to keep this channel free from sponsorships, that want to sell you stuff that you do not need, more importantly, want to take a minute of this video to tell you about a product that you couldn't care less about, $1 a month over on Patreon will keep this channel free from sponsorships. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, be kind to each other, be good to each other. And I shall see all of you in the next one. Peace.